Walter Harris was 92 years old, and everyone who came near his bedside could see the weight of years in his frail frame. His skin had grown thin, his hands were spotted and trembling, and his voice often cracked when he tried to speak. Yet behind his tired eyes there was still a spark of life, the same spark that had carried him through battles, storms, and decades of living. Walter had lived through things most people only read about in history books. He had fought in the war when he was barely out of his teenage years. He had watched friends fall beside him, carried burdens heavier than anyone could imagine, and then returned home to build a quiet life for himself. For years, he rarely spoke about the past. When his neighbors asked, he only gave polite smiles. When his grandchildren begged him for stories, he changed the subject to baseball or fishing. The memories were too heavy, too sharp to pull out freely. But now, lying in a hospice bed with the hum of machines filling the silence, Walter knew he couldn't keep everything locked away anymore. Time was running out. His son Michael stood awkwardly near the window. Michael was in his 50s, still fit, with a trimmed suit that seemed almost out of place in the quiet, dimly lit room. He had always been busy, too busy, Walter often thought. Work trips, board meetings, phone calls that never seemed to end. Michael was a good man, no doubt, but he had grown into someone who measured his life by schedules and deadlines. Walter sometimes worried that his son didn't know how to slow down, how to truly see the people around him. That afternoon, Michael had come straight from the office, his tie still tight around his neck. He looked tired, though he tried not to show it. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" he asked gently, though his eyes flicked toward his buzzing phone on the nightstand. Walter noticed, but he didn't hold it against him. Instead, he gave a small smile. "I've been better, son, but I've also been worse." They both laughed softly, though the sound quickly faded into silence. There was something unspoken in the room, something heavier than the smell of medicine or the ticking clock. Walter studied his son carefully, memorizing every detail of his face. The lines near his eyes, the graying hair at his temples, the tightness in his jaw. He thought of how quickly time had slipped through his hands. One moment he was carrying Michael on his shoulders. The next he was watching him sign business contracts and raise his own family. Walter cleared his throat, his voice raspy. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you." Michael looked up, a bit startled. "Of course, Dad, what is it?" For a long moment, Walter hesitated. It wasn't easy to dig into the past. He had carried this weight for so long, and speaking of it now felt like reopening an old wound. But he also knew this was his last chance. "You know, I don't talk much about the war," Walter began. His eyes drifted toward the window where sunlight fell across the curtain in soft stripes. "There are things I kept to myself, things I thought you didn't need to hear. But I was wrong. Before I leave this world, there's something I need you to do for me, a promise I need you to keep." Michael shifted in his chair. His father had never spoken so seriously, not in years. He leaned forward, placing his phone face down. "What kind of promise?" Walter's hand shook as he reached for a small wooden box on the nightstand. It was scratched, old, and nearly falling apart. Michael had seen it before, tucked away in drawers, but never paid much attention to it. Walter slowly opened the lid, revealing a faded photograph, a pair of dog tags, and a missing space where something once belonged. There was a medal, Walter whispered, "a Medal of Honor. It was given to me after the war, but I didn't keep it. I gave it away." Michael frowned. "Why would you give it away? That was your achievement, your recognition." Walter's eyes watered and his voice trembled as he went on. "I gave it to the family of a man who saved my life. My best friend. He was like a brother to me. When the fighting got bad, he threw himself into the line of fire so I could live. I promised myself that his family would know his sacrifice. I couldn't keep the medal when it was his courage that earned it. But somewhere along the years, that medal disappeared. His family moved, records were lost, and I lost track of them. For decades, I've wondered where it went. And now, son, my last wish is simple. Find that medal. Find his family. Give it back to them where it belongs." Michael stared at his father, speechless. He had never heard this story before. Never even imagined his father had carried such a heavy secret all his life. The man he had always seen as strong, unshakable, suddenly looked fragile, not because of age or sickness, but because of the weight of memory. "Dad," Michael began, his voice quiet. "That was so long ago. I wouldn't even know where to start. Records from the war, families moving around. It sounds impossible." Walter gripped his son's wrist with surprising strength. "Nothing is impossible, Michael. Not if it's worth doing. I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I'm asking you to finish something I started but couldn't complete. That medal doesn't belong to me, it belongs to them. I need you to make it right." The room fell silent again. Outside, a bird chirped on the window ledge, its sound cutting through the heaviness like a small reminder of life continuing on. Michael swallowed hard. He wanted to say yes, but his mind was racing with excuses. Work, deadlines, responsibilities. The practical part of him screamed that this was too much, too complicated. But then he looked at his father's eyes, old, tired yet filled with determination, and something shifted inside him. Michael nodded slowly. "All right, Dad, I'll try. I'll find it." Walter let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. His hand relaxed and a small smile crossed his lips. "Thank you, son. That means more than you'll ever know." Michael stayed longer than usual that evening. He listened to his father speak about things he had never shared before. Small details of the battlefield, the sound of boots in the mud, the brotherhood between soldiers, the pain of loss. Walter's voice cracked often, but each word seemed to lift a burden off his chest. When it was time to leave, Michael stood by the door, his mind still heavy with everything he had heard. He looked back at his father, who had already drifted off into sleep, the faint rise and fall of his chest showing the effort it took just to keep breathing. For the first time in years, Michael didn't feel like rushing back to his office or checking his emails. Instead, he sat in his car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, replaying his father's words in his mind. A dying wish. A medal lost in time, a promise that now rested on his shoulders. And though he didn't know it yet, saying yes that night would change not only the way he saw his father, but the way he saw his own life forever. Michael couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing his father's voice over and over again. The words, "Find that medal, find his family," repeated in his mind like an echo he couldn't silence. For most of his life, he had known his father as a quiet, reserved man who worked hard, raised his children, and lived simply. He had never thought much about the war beyond the old black and white photo of a young soldier tucked in a drawer. But now, with his father's frail hand gripping his wrist and his voice shaking with urgency, Michael realized there was a whole part of his father's life he had never truly understood. The next morning, Michael drove to the hospice before work. His father was sitting up in bed, his thin frame covered by a blanket, his breathing shallow but steady. When Michael walked in, Walter's face lit up with a tired smile. "You came early," Walter said softly. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you told me last night," Michael admitted. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "Dad, I need to know everything. If I'm going to find this medal, I need more than just a story. Tell me about him. Tell me about the man who saved you." Walter's eyes grew distant, as if he were no longer in that small room but back in a muddy field decades ago. His voice trembled at first, but the more he spoke, the stronger it became. "His name was Thomas," Walter began. "We were just kids back then, though we thought we were men. He was from a small farming town, the kind of place where neighbors shared bread and everyone knew your name. He used to talk about going back to the fields after the war, maybe starting a family. He was strong, but more than that, he had a kind heart. He'd give away his rations if he saw someone hungrier than him, and when the bullets started flying, he didn't think twice. He threw himself in front of me. I lived because he didn't." Walter stopped for a moment, his eyes wet, his voice breaking. "They gave me the medal after that. But it never felt right. How could I accept honor when the real hero was gone? So I went to his parents after the war. I handed it to them." His mother cried. His father shook my hand, and for a moment I felt like I'd done the right thing. But life goes on, people move, families scatter. Somewhere along the line, the medal disappeared, and for years I've wondered what happened to it. Michael listened in silence, his heart heavier with every word. He had seen his father as many things, strong, stubborn, sometimes distant, but he had never seen this side of him, this deep wound that had never healed. "Dad," Michael said gently, "do you know where his family went after?" "Did you stay in touch?" Walter shook his head. "For a while, yes. Letters, Christmas cards, but time has a way of pulling people apart. I know they moved away from that town. That's all I remember. Records might exist somewhere. Maybe military archives. Maybe local papers. I don't know. But if anyone can do this, it's you." Michael wanted to argue again, to say it was too complicated, that he wasn't the right person for this. But when he looked into his father's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. It was faint, but it was there, and it was worth holding on to. Later that day, Michael sat in his car outside his office, staring at the tall glass building where his team was waiting for him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like going inside. The numbers, the contracts, the endless meetings, all of it felt small compared to what his father had asked him to do. He realized this wasn't just about a medal. It was about giving peace to a man who had carried a burden for more than 70 years. That evening, after work, Michael pulled out his laptop and began searching. He typed in his father's unit, the name Thomas, the year of the battle. Page after page of articles, records, and faded photographs appeared. He scribbled notes, trying to piece together fragments of information like a puzzle. Hours passed, and when he finally shut the laptop, he felt both exhausted and strangely alive. Over the next week, Michael visited his father every day. Each time, Walter shared a little more. He described Thomas's laugh, the way he used to sing songs at night when the soldiers were cold and afraid. He talked about promises they made to each other if they ever made it home. Michael began to feel like he knew Thomas even though he had never met him. The man wasn't just a name anymore. He was a real person with dreams, hopes, and a life cut short. One afternoon, Walter reached for Michael's hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were sharp. "Michael," he whispered, "don't give up no matter how hard it gets. This isn't just my story. It's his story. It deserves to be told." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "I promise, Dad, I'll do whatever it takes." At home, Michael found himself talking less about work and more about his father's past. His wife noticed the change. His children noticed too. For the first time in a long time, Michael wasn't just moving through life on autopilot. He was connecting. Really connecting with his family, with his father, and with a piece of history he had ignored for too long. One night, as he was sorting through old boxes of his father's belongings, Michael found a bundle of letters tied together with string. They were yellowed with age, the ink fading, but the words were still legible. They were letters from Thomas written during the war. Michael sat at the kitchen table reading them one by one. Thomas wrote about missing home, about the farm, about his dreams of starting a family. He wrote about Walter, too, about how they kept each other sane, how they planned to return home together. The last letter ended abruptly, just days before the battle where he gave his life. Tears blurred Michael's vision as he folded the letters back into their bundle. Holding them, he felt the weight of history pressing against his chest. These weren't just words on paper. They were a young man's voice echoing across time, and now, it was his responsibility to carry that voice forward. The next day, Michael returned to his father's bedside with the letters. Walter's hands shook as he held them, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting he hadn't seen in decades. He wept quietly, his shoulders shaking, and Michael sat beside him, placing a hand on his back. "I thought these were lost," Walter whispered. "I thought I'd never hear his words again." Michael didn't say much. He just sat there, letting his father grieve, letting him remember. For the first time in a long time, there was no rush, no schedule to keep, just a father and son connected through memory and promise. That night, as Walter drifted off to sleep, Michael whispered softly, almost to himself, "I'll find it, Dad. I'll find them. You can rest knowing I won't let this end here." Michael knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be dead ends, frustrations, and long nights of searching. But he also knew this wasn't just about fulfilling a wish. It was about giving his father peace and honoring a man who had been forgotten by time. And somewhere deep inside, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. Michael sat at his desk late at night staring at the computer screen. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the machine and the ticking clock on the wall. His family had gone to bed hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to close the laptop. His father's voice was still fresh in his ears. "Don't give up no matter how hard it gets." The truth was, Michael didn't know where to begin. The war had been so many decades ago. Records were scattered, families had moved, names had been lost to time. He typed words into the search bar. World War II soldier, Thomas, Medal of Honor, unit records. Page after page came up, but most of it felt like looking for a needle in a haystack. Still, he pressed on. At first, his efforts were clumsy. He found himself scrolling through old newspapers online, reading lists of fallen soldiers, and checking veteran memorial websites. Each time he thought he had found something, it turned out to be a dead end. A different Thomas, a different unit, a different story. Frustration grew inside him, and he often thought about giving up. But then he remembered the look in his father's eyes when he asked him to find the medal, that look of hope, faint but burning. He couldn't walk away from it. One evening, Michael drove to his father's house to search through the old boxes stored in the attic. Dust clung to his hands as he opened cartons filled with faded photographs, folded uniforms, and yellowed papers. He found a service book with names scribbled inside, a few postcards sent from overseas, and even a torn map with markings that looked like battle routes. Among the boxes, he discovered a diary. Not his father's, but a small pocket-sized notebook with another name on the first page. It was Thomas's. The pages were filled with short notes, some about the weather, some about meals, and some about fear and longing for home. Reading those entries, Michael felt as if he were stepping into the shoes of a young man who had sacrificed everything. The diary gave him a clue, a hometown, written in neat letters, the name of a small farming town that Thomas often mentioned. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The following weekend, Michael got into his car and began the drive. The town was several hours away, tucked between rolling fields and quiet country roads. When he arrived, it felt like stepping back in time. The streets were small, the houses simple, and people walked slowly as if the world hadn't changed much in decades. He stopped at the local library, where an elderly woman worked at the front desk. Michael introduced himself and explained that he was looking for information about a soldier who had lived in the town many years ago. At first, the woman looked at him curiously, then her face softened. She led him to a section filled with old records, yearbooks, and town archives. Michael spent hours flipping through dusty pages. Eventually, he found a small article in a local newspaper dated from the war years. It mentioned a young soldier named Thomas who had died in battle, and how the town mourned his loss. The article spoke of his parents, their grief, and the pride they felt in his bravery. But after that, the trail went cold. There were no records of where the family had gone after the war, no clear information about what happened to them. Michael felt discouraged but not defeated. Before leaving, he spoke with a few older townspeople sitting on a bench outside the grocery store. He asked if anyone remembered the family. One man nodded slowly. "I was just a boy, but I remember them," he said. "They moved not long after the war. Lost the farm, I think. Heard they went to the city to find work." It wasn't much, but it was another piece of the puzzle. Michael thanked him and drove back home, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Back at his father's bedside that night, Michael shared what he had found. Walter listened with tears in his eyes, gripping his son's hand tightly. "You're closer than I ever was," Walter whispered. "I knew you could do it." Michael stayed quiet, but inside he felt a strange mix of pride and pressure. For the first time, he understood what his father had carried for so long. The guilt, the responsibility, the unfinished promise. Now it was his to complete. Over the next few weeks, Michael poured himself into the search. He contacted veteran associations, historical societies, and even posted on online forums asking if anyone knew of Thomas's descendants. Some responses were kind, some were dismissive, and many led nowhere. But little by little, pieces of information came together. He found records showing that Thomas's parents had indeed moved to the city. He tracked down an address, though the house no longer belonged to them. He found an old obituary that mentioned a daughter, Thomas's younger sister. That was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The obituary listed her children's names, and Michael realized he might be able to find living relatives. The idea sent a chill down his spine. After weeks of searching, the possibility of returning the medal to Thomas's family felt real. But there was one problem: the medal itself. Michael knew where it had started, but he had no idea where it had ended up. If Thomas's family had lost it, if it had been sold, misplaced, or forgotten in some attic, how could he possibly find it now? One evening, sitting in the quiet of his study, Michael closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had promised his father he wouldn't give up. He couldn't stop now. The next day, he visited a military memorabilia collector in the city, someone he found through a veterans group. The man had shelves lined with medals, uniforms, and flags, each with a story attached. Michael explained his search, and the man listened carefully. Then he shook his head. "Medals like that get lost all the time," the collector said. Families move, things get sold at estate sales or donated. But sometimes they come back. If you've got the name and the story, you might just find it. Michael left with a renewed sense of determination. He didn't have the medal yet, but he had the story, the diary, and the letters. And maybe, just maybe, those would lead him to the family and the missing piece of history. That night, when he visited his father, Walter seemed weaker. His breathing was shallow, his words softer. Michael leaned close as Walter whispered, "Did you find them?" "Not yet," Michael said honestly. "But I'm close. I promise, Dad, I won't stop until I do." Walter smiled faintly, his eyes closing. That's all I needed to hear. Michael sat there long after his father drifted off to sleep, holding his hand, feeling the weight of both the promise and the love that bound them. He realized that this journey wasn't just about honoring a fallen soldier anymore. It was about connecting with his father in a way he never had before, about carrying his story forward, about learning what it truly meant to keep a promise. And as he drove home in the quiet night, the road stretching endlessly before him, Michael knew this was only the beginning. The hardest part was still ahead. Michael woke up earlier than usual that Saturday morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee in his hands, staring at the stack of papers and notes he had gathered during the past few weeks. Each page held a clue, an obituary, an address, a photograph. It wasn't just research anymore. It felt like he was chasing the voice of a man he had never met, but had come to know through stories, letters, and his father's trembling words. That morning, Michael had a new lead. He had managed to trace Thomas's younger sister, who had passed away many years earlier. But in her obituary, he had noticed something that gave him hope. She had a daughter. If that daughter was still alive, she would be the niece of the soldier who saved his father's life. Michael had written down a possible address, though he wasn't sure if it was current. He hesitated as he stared at the slip of paper. Driving there, knocking on a stranger's door, and telling them about a story from decades ago, it felt overwhelming. But then he thought of his father lying in the hospice bed waiting for closure. He thought of the medal that had vanished and the man who had never been properly honored. With a deep breath, Michael grabbed his coat and set out on the road. The drive took several hours through winding highways and quiet neighborhoods. His mind wandered as he drove, imagining what he would say if someone actually opened the door. How could he explain everything without sounding like a stranger digging into private family history? Would they believe him? Would they even care? Finally, he pulled up in front of a modest brick house with a small garden out front. His heart raced as he stepped out of the car and walked up the path. He raised his hand and knocked on the door. For a few seconds there was silence. Then the door opened, and a woman in her late 40s appeared, holding a dish towel in her hands. She looked at him curiously. "Can I help you?" she asked. Michael cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Michael Harris. I know this might sound unusual, but I've been trying to track down the family of a soldier who fought in the war with my father. I believe you might be related." The woman tilted her head, clearly surprised. "A soldier?" "Yes," Michael continued, his voice steady but soft. "His name was Thomas. He was my father's closest friend during the war. He saved my father's life. My dad has never forgotten him. He gave your family his medal after the war, but over time it disappeared. My father's last wish is for me to return it. I've been searching for your family, and I believe you're his niece." The woman's expression changed. Her eyes widened, and she stepped back slightly, motioning for him to come inside. Michael hesitated, then followed her into the living room, where framed photographs lined the walls. She set the towel down and looked at him carefully. "My name is Emily," she said quietly. "And yes, Thomas was my uncle. I never met him, but I grew up hearing stories from my mother. She said he was the bravest person she had ever known. We don't have much from him anymore, just a few old letters. But a medal?" Her voice faltered. "I've never seen it. I didn't even know it existed." Michael nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid of. Somewhere along the line it was lost. But I'm not here just for the medal. I wanted to find you. I wanted you to know what he did, and how much it meant to my father. He's 92 now, and he hasn't stopped thinking about your uncle since the day it happened." Emily sat down on the sofa, her eyes glossy with emotion. "We always knew he died a hero, but no one ever told us the full story. To hear it from someone who was there, that's different. That means something." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He reached into his bag and pulled out the bundle of letters he had found in his father's attic. These were his. He wrote them during the war. My father kept them safe all these years. I think they belong with you now. Emily's hands trembled as she took the letters. She held them to her chest for a moment before carefully opening the first one. Her eyes moved across the faded handwriting and tears began to spill down her cheeks. This is his voice, she whispered. This is the closest I've ever been to meeting him. The room grew quiet, filled only with the sound of pages turning. Michael sat silently, giving her time to absorb the weight of it. After a while, Emily looked up. Thank you, she said. Thank you for not letting his memory fade. Most people forget, but you didn't. Michael shook his head. It wasn't me. It was my father. He carried this for 70 years. He wanted me to find you, to return what belongs to your family. The medal may still be out there, and if it is, I'll do everything I can to bring it back to you. Emily nodded, wiping her tears. Even if you never find it, this... She held up the letters. This is more than I ever dreamed of. It's a part of him I thought was gone forever. For the next hour, they sat together as Michael shared the stories his father had told him. He spoke of the long nights in the trenches, of the songs Thomas sang to lift the spirits of weary soldiers, of the moment he gave his life so that Walter could live. Emily listened with both grief and pride, her face a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Before leaving, Michael asked if she knew of any other relatives, anyone else who might have kept the medal. Emily thought for a moment. My mother once mentioned that after her parents passed, some of their belongings were given to relatives in another state. I don't know what happened to everything. It's possible the medal ended up there. Michael wrote down the details, feeling both hopeful and anxious. The journey wasn't over yet, but he was closer than ever. As he drove back home that evening, he thought about what had just happened. He had walked into a stranger's home and walked out with a connection that felt like family. For the first time, he felt the weight of the promise beginning to lift, if only a little. When he returned to the hospice, he went straight to his father's room. Walter was awake but weak, his breathing shallow. Michael sat beside him and held his hand. Dad, he whispered, I found her. I found his niece. She knows everything now. I gave her the letters. She cried when she read them. She said she's proud. She knows what he did for you. Walter's eyes filled with tears and a smile spread across his tired face. You found her, he said softly. You did it. Michael squeezed his hand. We haven't found the medal yet, but we're close. I promise I'll keep looking. Walter closed his eyes, his smile still there. That's enough for me. Knowing his family remembers him, knowing his story isn't lost, that's enough. Michael stayed with him until he fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in a long while, his father looked at peace. Driving home that night, Michael felt a sense of clarity. This journey had started as a task, something he felt pressured into. But now it was more than that. It was about honoring not only his father's wish, but also the sacrifice of a man whose courage had given their family everything. And though the search for the medal was not yet over, Michael knew that in finding Thomas's family, he had already uncovered something far more valuable: the truth, the connection, and the reminder that some promises are worth chasing, no matter how hard the road may be. The day Michael returned to his father's bedside, there was a strange calm in the air. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and flowers someone had left earlier in the week. Walter, the old veteran, was lying peacefully, his breaths slow but steady, his face pale but dignified. Michael sat beside him, holding a small wooden box tightly in his hands. Inside that box was the medal his father had spoken about, the very medal that carried decades of history, friendship, sacrifice, and love. Michael leaned closer, speaking softly. Dad, I found it. I found the family. Your promise is kept. His voice cracked as he opened the box and held the medal where Walter could see it. The old man's eyes flickered open, weak but alive. When he saw the medal, a tear formed in the corner of his eye. His trembling hand reached out, brushing against it, as though the simple piece of metal carried the weight of a lifetime. Michael continued, telling his father everything. He told him about the search, the sleepless nights, the piles of documents, the veterans who shared stories, and finally about meeting the granddaughter of Walter's friend. He described how she held the medal with shaking hands, how tears ran down her face when she learned of her grandfather's bravery, and how grateful she was to know the truth. Walter listened, not saying much, but his eyes spoke louder than words. They shone with pride, relief, and a sense of peace that Michael had never seen before. For a moment, father and son sat there, neither speaking but both knowing something extraordinary had been completed. Later that evening, Michael placed the medal on the nightstand beside Walter's bed. The old man fell asleep with a faint smile on his face, the kind of smile that comes only when a heart has no more burdens to carry. By the next morning, Walter had passed away quietly in his sleep. He left the world the way he had lived his life, bravely and with honor. Michael was heartbroken, but at the same time he felt a strange sense of strength inside him. He knew he had given his father the one thing he wanted most before leaving this world, and in doing so he had discovered parts of his father's life he had never known. A week later, Michael returned to the small town where the granddaughter lived. Together, they held a small ceremony in the local community hall. Veterans, families, and townsfolk gathered. Michael stood before them, holding the medal, and spoke about his father's story, how a young soldier survived the war because of a friend, and how he carried that friend's memory for the rest of his life. As he handed the medal to the granddaughter, the room fell silent. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment. The medal was more than medal and ribbon. It was a promise kept, a sacrifice remembered, and a bridge between two families who had been connected long before they ever met. Tears filled many eyes, and when the granddaughter hugged Michael tightly, he felt the warmth of gratitude and healing. After the ceremony, Michael sat quietly outside, watching the sunset. For the first time, he didn't feel like just a businessman rushing through life. He felt like a son who had honored his father, and like a man who had been given a new understanding of what really mattered. He thought about the letters and journals he had discovered, pages filled with his father's handwriting, filled with stories of bravery, fear, friendship, and hope. Those stories would no longer be hidden. Michael decided to share them, not just with his family but with others, so that the next generation could learn about sacrifice and honor. When he returned home, Michael gathered his own children. He sat them down and told them everything, not only about their grandfather's war days, but also about the journey he had taken to fulfill his wish. He showed them the old photos, the faded letters, and the journals. His children listened, their eyes wide, their respect for their grandfather growing with each word. "Your grandfather wasn't just a soldier," Michael told them. "He was a man who lived with honor. He kept promises, he valued friendship, and he carried love in everything he did. That's the kind of person we should all try to be." In the days that followed, Michael felt a shift within himself. He no longer saw his father as the strict man who raised him, but as a hero, a friend, and a teacher. He began spending more time with his family, making sure his children knew that love and time were worth more than money or success. He also became active in veterans' causes, speaking at local events, raising awareness, and sharing his father's story. The memory of Walter lived on, not just in medals or journals, but in the hearts of those who heard the story. Michael often found himself standing at his father's grave, not in sadness, but in quiet reflection. He would place fresh flowers and whisper, "Dad, your story is safe with me, and so is your promise." And every time he did, he felt a sense of closeness, as if his father was still walking beside him, reminding him of the values that mattered most: loyalty, courage, and love. What started as a dying wish had turned into a legacy not measured in wealth or status, but in the way one life could touch so many others. Walter's story had not ended with his death. It had only just begun through Michael and through the people who would carry it forward. For Michael, the medal was never about war or recognition. It was about love, love for a friend, love for a promise, and love between a father and a son. And that love, he knew, would never die.